Sir, with all due respect, that's a ghost. 1,700 yards with this crosswind, we're sending rounds into the next county. The voice of Corporal Evans was sharp, a razor's edge of youthful confidence honed by the initial phases of Scout Sniper School. He was talking to his instructor, Gunnery Sergeant Henderson, but his words were loud enough for the small cluster of shivering candidates to hear. It was a statement of fact, not an excuse, delivered with the unshakable certainty of a man who trusts his state-of-the-art M40A6 rifle and the advanced optics perched on top of it more than he trusts anything else in the world. He believed in data, in ballistics calculators, in the precise click values of his turret knobs. And the data, on this wind-swept day at Stone Bay, was telling him the target was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Gunnery Sergeant Henderson, a man whose face was a roadmap of deployments etched by sun and stress, didn't even look at the corporal. His gaze was fixed downrange, through a spotting scope that seemed like a permanent extension of his eye. The heat mirage rising from the dusty ground made the distant steel silhouette of a man-sized target dance and shimmer, a hazy specter at the edge of visibility. "The wind isn't the problem, Evans," Henderson said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried no hint of argument. "The problem is you're trying to command the bullet. You don't command it, you ask it. You gotta ask it nice." This piece of Zen-like wisdom was met with a barely suppressed snort from one of the other candidates, a lance corporal named Greer. Evans, for his part, maintained his military bearing, but a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He had fired 3 shots. 3 perfectly executed shots, from a technical standpoint. His breathing was controlled, his trigger squeeze a textbook example of smooth, rearward pressure. Yet all 3 rounds had been ghosts, vanishing into the North Carolina terrain without so much as a puff of dust or the satisfying ping of steel. He had adjusted for windage, for elevation, for Coriolis effect. He had done everything the manuals and the instructors had taught him. The failure wasn't his. It was a failure of physics. The distance was simply too great for the conditions. The range was a cathedral of disciplined noise. To their left, a platoon of infantry recruits was qualifying on the 500-yard line, the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of their M4s a constant, almost soothing background chatter. But here, on the known distance range reserved for the sniper candidates, the silence between shots was immense, heavy with concentration and the weight of expectation. Each shot was a complex mathematical equation solved in a heartbeat, a negotiation between man, machine, and an unforgiving natural world. When a rifle like Evans's M40A6 barked, its deep, authoritative crack echoing off the earthen berms, it felt like an event. The silence that followed was a held breath, every eye straining to see the result miles away. The repeated lack of that result was starting to curdle the air, turning focus into frustration. The candidates were the cream of the crop, young Marines who had proven themselves exceptional riflemen, physically fit and mentally tough. They were alpha predators in training, and failure was a language they were unaccustomed to speaking. Evans, more than any of them, embodied this ethos. He was a born leader, confident to the point of arrogance, his movements sharp and economical. He saw the world as a series of problems to be solved with aggression and superior technology. This 1,700-yard target was just the first problem his current toolkit couldn't solve, and it was galling. He meticulously cleaned the bolt of his rifle, the metallic scrape of brush on steel, a small angry sound in the quiet. He rechecked his dope chart, tapping the laminated card against his stock as if the numbers might change their minds. He was searching for a data-based error, a miscalculation he could correct. He refused to accept that the solution might lie in something less tangible, something like what the gunny had just said. Asking a bullet was for poets, not for Marines. Marines gave orders, to enemies, to subordinates, to their own equipment. The world was supposed to listen. Into this tableau of high-tech frustration walked a man who seemed to have wandered in from another century. He was old, probably well into his 70s, with a face like tanned leather and eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. He wore simple denim jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and a pair of worn leather boots that looked like they'd logged more miles than all the candidates' combat boots combined. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, not the stiffness of old age, but a placid certainty of movement, as if he never took a step without knowing exactly where his foot would land. In his hands, he carried not a marvel of modern engineering, but a relic. It was a U.S. rifle, model of 1903, the Springfield. But it wasn't just any '03. Gunny Henderson, a student of military history, recognized it instantly. The high hump of the upper receiver, the specific milling marks, the straight-gripped stock. It was an early model, likely made before or during the First World War. The wood of the stock was dark with age and linseed oil, worn smooth in all the places a man's hands would go. The steel of the barrel and action had faded from a deep military black to a soft, pewter gray. It was, to the eyes of the young Marines with their polymer stocks and Picatinny rails, a museum piece, an antique. The old man approached the firing line with a quiet deference, stopping a respectful distance behind Gunnery Sergeant Henderson. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching the heat waves dance down range. Henderson had noticed him the moment he'd stepped out of his beat-up Ford pickup in the parking lot. He'd watched the old man uncase the rifle with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. There was something in his posture, a rigid straightness in his spine that belied his age, an unnerving stillness that set him apart from the usual civilian guests who sometimes used the long-distance range on weekends. Henderson felt a strange prickle of recognition, a sense that he was looking at something familiar but couldn't quite place it. He saw the way the man's eyes didn't just look downrange. They scanned, taking in the wind flags, the subtle sway of the tall grass on the berms, the direction the clouds were scudding. It was an unconscious, systematic assessment of the environment that Henderson had only ever seen in one type of person. Corporal Evans finally broke the silence, his voice laced with an exasperated curiosity. "Can we help you, sir?" he asked, his tone pitched just on the polite side of condescending. He looked from the old man to the ancient rifle and back again, a small, incredulous smile playing on his lips. It was the look of a fighter pilot being shown a biplane. The old man's pale eyes shifted to Evans. They were calm, missing the roomy quality of age. They were startlingly clear and focused. "Just enjoying the day," he said, his voice quiet but not weak. It was a voice that didn't waste words. "Having a bit of trouble with that far one, are you?" He nodded his head towards the shimmering, distant target. Evans's jaw tightened. The question was innocent enough, but coming from this relic of a man holding a relic of a rifle, it felt like a judgment. "It's 1,700 yards, Pop," Evans said, the respectful "sir" replaced with a more familiar, dismissive term. The wind's gusting 15 to 20 miles per hour, switching directions. "It's not a shot, it's a prayer." He gestured to his own rifle, a symphony of matte black steel, carbon fiber, and high-end glass. And that's with a .308 Winchester match round and a Schmidt and Bender scope. "What's that thing you've got there? A 30-06? The old man gave a slight nod. "Yes, government issue. Lake City Arsenal, 1918. He said it not with pride or defensiveness, but as a simple statement of fact, like mentioning the color of his shirt. This detail only deepened Evans's amusement. He was shooting with ammunition that was over a century old. It was absurd. Gunnery Sergeant Henderson turned then, having seen and heard enough. He had a choice. He could politely ask the old man to remain in the spectator area, which was standard procedure, or he could listen to the insistent whisper in the back of his mind, the part of him that was a trained observer of men. He looked at the old man's hands, wrapped gently around the Springfield stock. They were gnarled with age, the knuckles swollen, but they were rock steady. There were faint, silvery scars crisscrossing the backs of them, the kind you get from machinery or metal, not from a life spent behind a desk. His posture was the tell. It wasn't the ramrod straightness of a parade ground Marine. It was something else. It was the settled, centered posture of a man who had spent a lifetime making his body a stable firing platform. "You want to try it?" Henderson heard himself say. The words surprised even him. The candidates looked at him, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright shock. Evans blinked. "Gunny?" he said, his voice a sharp note of protest. "We've got a training schedule. We can't just let civilians." "He's a veteran," Henderson cut in, his voice quiet but absolute. He didn't know how he knew, he just knew. "He can take one shot." The old man looked at Henderson, a flicker of something, gratitude perhaps, or simple understanding, in his pale eyes. He gave another small, single nod. "Much obliged, Gunny." The title rolled off his tongue with a familiarity that sent another ripple of curiosity through Henderson. He hadn't introduced himself by rank. The old man, who introduced himself simply as Samuel, didn't use the high-tech shooting rests or sandbags the candidates favored. Instead, he unrolled a small piece of worn canvas and laid it on the ground. From a simple leather pouch on his belt, he produced a single, tarnished brass cartridge. He held it in his palm for a moment, his thumb rubbing over the head stamp, a small, private ritual. Corporal Evans watched with a smirk, crossing his arms. This was going to be a joke. The old man would lie down, probably struggle to see the target with those ancient iron sights, and lob a round somewhere into the dirt 1,000 yards short. It would be a harmless bit of theater, a way to humor the elderly before they could get back to the serious business of training. Samuel lay down on the canvas, his movements fluid and economical, a stark contrast to the way most men his age got up from a chair. He settled into the prone position as if he were sinking into a favorite armchair. There was no fidgeting, no wasted motion. He just became part of the ground. He adjusted the leather sling on the rifle, not using it merely as a carrying strap, but wrapping it around his left arm with practiced precision, creating a cradle of tension that locked the rifle butt firmly into the pocket of his shoulder. Gunny Henderson watched, his fascination growing. That was an old-school technique, the hasty sling, taught to generations of Marines at Paris Island and San Diego, a fundamental skill that had been largely supplanted by bipods and fancy equipment. To see it done so flawlessly was like watching a dead language spoken aloud. Samuel didn't rush. He lay there for a full minute, motionless, just breathing. His eyes were on the wind flags, but he seemed to be sensing more than seeing. He watched the way the mirage flowed, reading the subtle shifts in its shimmering waves. The candidates saw an old man with an old gun. Henderson saw a master craftsman examining his materials. He saw a man having a silent conversation with the wind. The younger Marines began to grow impatient. Greer shifted his weight from foot to foot. Evans let out an audible sigh. "Any day now, Grandpa," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Henderson to hear. The gunny shot him a look that could have stripped paint. Evans fell silent, but his expression of bored superiority remained. Finally, Samuel seemed satisfied. He worked the bolt on the Springfield. The sound was nothing like the slick, tight schlick-schlack of a modern custom action. It was a heavier, more mechanical sound, a solid clack chunk as the steel lugs locked into place. It was the sound of history, of industrial might from a bygone era. He brought his eye to the rear sight, a simple aperture sight, a tiny hole in a piece of steel. There was no magnification, no parallax adjustment, no illuminated reticule. He would be aiming at a target that was, to the naked eye, little more than a tiny, indistinct speck, blurred by heat and distance. It was an impossible proposition. Even with a scope, it was a Herculean task. With iron sights, it was a miracle. Samuel's breathing slowed, becoming deep and rhythmic. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. Henderson watched the old man's back. He saw the rise and fall of his chest become shallower and shallower until, for a long moment, it seemed to stop altogether. He had entered the bubble, that sacred space of pure concentration where the world outside the sights ceases to exist. The range fell silent. The pop, pop, pop of the recruits' rifles seemed to fade away. Even the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. There was only the old man, the old rifle, and the impossible distance. Then the rifle spoke. It wasn't the sharp crack of the .308 rounds the candidates were using. It was a deeper, more profound boom, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very air. The 1918 Springfield jumped in his shoulder, but he rode the recoil, his body absorbing the force with an ingrained familiarity. The heavy bolt cycled in his hand, a smooth, practiced motion, ejecting the spent brass casing in a perfect, glittering arc. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye, with and without optics, was fixed on the distant target. A second passed, then 2, 3. The flight time for a bullet over that distance was an eternity. Evans was already shaking his head, a dismissive smile returning to his face. He had known it. A complete miss. 4 seconds. 5. And then it came. A sound, not loud, but utterly distinct. A clear, high, metallic ping that traveled back across the 1,700 yards of open space, a triumphant note cutting through the wind. For a moment, no one moved. The sound hung in the air, seemingly impossible. The candidates stared downrange, their mouths slightly agape. Corporal Evans's smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. He grabbed his rifle, dropped to his belly, and peered through his high-powered scope, frantically dialing the magnification to its maximum. There, on the shimmering steel silhouette, dead center mass, was a fresh mark. A small, dark smudge, a perfect punctuation mark at the end of an impossible sentence. "No way," whispered Greer, the lance corporal. "No possible way." Evans said nothing. He just stared through his scope, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. The data was wrong. The calculators were wrong. The laws of physics as he understood them had just been casually defied by a man who looked like he belonged in a VFW hall, using a rifle that belonged in a museum. Gunnery Sergeant Henderson felt a slow smile spread across his own face. It wasn't amusement. It was a deep, powerful sense of vindication, of witnessing something true and profound. He had trusted his instincts about the old man, and they had been proven right in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. He walked over and knelt beside Samuel, who was already calmly reloading, pushing another polished brass cartridge into the magazine. "That was a hell of a shot, sir," Henderson said, his voice filled with a respect that had been absent from everyone else's. Samuel looked up, his pale eyes calm. "Wind died down for a second," he said, as if that simple observation explained everything. "You just have to wait for the lull. It always comes." It was the kind of simple, profound wisdom that couldn't be learned from a manual. It had to be lived. Henderson knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a shooter of a caliber that Henderson had rarely encountered, even in the elite echelons of the Marine Corps. The name started to form in his mind, a legend whispered about in sniper schools, a ghost from a past conflict. A name associated with impossible shots and an almost supernatural understanding of ballistics. He pushed the thought aside for a moment, wanting to see how this played out. Evans finally stood up, his face a jumble of emotions, confusion, embarrassment, and a dawning, grudging respect. The arrogance was gone, sandblasted away by that single, ringing impact of steel on steel. He walked over to where Samuel was still lying on his canvas mat. He looked down at the old rifle, then at the old man. "How?" Evans asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, the question of a student to a master. "How did you do that? My scope's got a Horus reticle. I've got a Kestrel weather meter. I calculated everything. Spin drift, aerodynamic jump, everything. I was still missing by feet. You don't even have a scope." Samuel looked up at the young, humbled Marine. He saw not the arrogance from before, but the raw curiosity of a true rifleman who wants to understand. He decided the boy had earned an answer. He patted the ground beside him. "Lie down, son," he said gently. Hesitantly, Evans knelt, then lay down in the dirt next to the old man. The crisp digital camouflage of his uniform a stark contrast to Samuel's worn denim. "Forget your computers for a minute," Samuel began, his voice taking on a professorial tone. "They're tools, good tools, but they only tell you what the wind is doing here." He pointed to the anemometer on Evans's pack. That target is a mile away. The wind over there could be doing something completely different. It usually is. He pointed downrange with a steady, gnarled finger. You see the mirage? The way it's flowing? Right now, it's running left to right. But look farther out, near that little rise. See how it looks like it's boiling straight up? That means you've got a headwind or a tailwind in that patch. You have to read the land. You have to read the air all the way there, not just where you're standing. He was giving a master class, not just in shooting, but in observation, in a kind of Zen-like awareness that Evans had never even considered. Evans listened, rapt. This was knowledge that wasn't in any textbook. This was the art, not the science. Now, you're breathing, Samuel continued, his voice low and steady. You stop breathing when you shoot, right? The natural respiratory pause? Evans nodded. Yes, sir, that's what they teach us. It's what they teach everyone, Samuel agreed. It's good, but for a shot like this, a long one, you can't just stop. Your heart is still beating, and every time it beats, it sends a little tremor through your body, through the rifle. At 100 yards, it doesn't matter. At 1,000, it matters a little. At 1,700, your heartbeat can push the round off target by a foot or more. He paused, letting the information sink in. You don't stop breathing. You slow it down until it's almost nothing, and you learn the rhythm of your own heart. You squeeze the trigger between the beats. Evans stared at him, dumbfounded. It was a level of infinitesimal control he had never imagined. He had focused on mastering his weapon, his trigger finger, his lungs. He had never once thought about mastering his own pulse. Now, the gun, Samuel said, patting the warm wooden stock of the Springfield. This old girl, she's got character. Modern rifles are stiff, rigid. They're designed not to bend. This one has a wooden stock. It breathes. It swells and shrinks with the humidity. The barrel isn't free-floated. The way you put pressure on the sling, on the forend, it changes where the bullet goes. You don't fight it. You learn it. You learn to feel it. After a few thousand rounds, you know what it's going to do before it does it. It's not just a tool. It's a partner. He worked the bolt again and slid another cartridge into the chamber. He looked at Evans. You want to try it? He offered the rifle to the young corporal. Evans looked from the ancient weapon to the old man's face. This was more than just a chance to shoot a piece of history. It was an offering, a bridge across generations. He nodded, his throat suddenly tight. Yes, sir, I would. He carefully took the heavy rifle. It felt alien in his hands, all wood and steel, solid and dense compared to his lightweight M40. He settled into the prone position, trying to mimic Samuel's fluid motion, but feeling clumsy and awkward. He tried to wrap the sling around his arm the way he'd seen the old man do it. Samuel reached over and gently adjusted the leather, his touch surprisingly strong and sure. Like this, he said. Let it take the weight. Evans sighted down the long barrel, peering through the tiny aperture. The front sight post was a simple blade of steel. The target, a mile away, was a blurry, almost invisible shape. I can barely see it, he said, his voice full of doubt. You're not looking at the target, Samuel said softly, his voice right next to Evans's ear. You're looking at the front sight post. That has to be crystal clear. Let the target be blurry. Your mind knows where it is. Trust your mind. Now, breathe. Just breathe. Feel the wind on your face. It's steady now. Hold 2 feet to the left. Just trust me. 2 feet. Now, listen to your heart. Evans closed his eyes for a second, focusing inward. He felt the slow, steady thump-thump in his chest. He breathed out, held, and felt the rhythm. Thump-thump, pause. Thump-thump, pause. It was there. It had always been there. A tiny engine inside him he'd never paid attention to. He opened his eyes, focused on the front sight, placed it on the blurry shape of the target, holding it what he estimated to be 2 feet into the wind. He felt the pause between heartbeats coming. In that silent, fractional moment, he squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared, kicking his shoulder with an authority that startled him. He worked the bolt, his movements clumsy compared to Samuel's grace. He waited, his own heart now hammering in his chest, the lesson about shooting between the beats momentarily forgotten in the excitement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ping! The sound was just as clear, just as sweet. Evans let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He'd done it. He'd hit an impossible target with a 100-year-old rifle on his first try. But he knew it wasn't his shot. It was Samuel's. He had just been the instrument. He rolled over and looked at the old man, his eyes shining with a newfound profound respect. "Sir, thank you." Samuel just gave him a small, gentle smile. "The rifle knows the way," he said. "You just have to learn how to listen to it." He stood up, his joints creaking softly, and took the rifle back from Evans, cradling it in his arms. He nodded to Gunnery Sergeant Henderson. "Thank you for the time, Gunny." Henderson finally found his voice, the name he'd been chasing now solidifying in his mind. "May I ask your name, sir? Your full name?" The old man paused, his pale blue eyes meeting Henderson's. "Samuel Keene," he said quietly. Henderson's breath caught in his throat. It was him, Samuel the Ghost Keene. A Marine Corps legend from the war in Vietnam. A scout sniper credited with some of the longest and most difficult shots in the history of the Corps, all made with a modified Winchester Model 70. A rifle not much younger than the Springfield he now held. He was a ghost story told to sniper candidates, a mythical figure. And he was standing right here. "It's an honor, Master Gunnery Sergeant," Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion as he snapped to the position of attention. He used Keene's final, retired rank. Keene just smiled again, a sad, knowing smile. "That was a long time ago, Gunny. Today, I'm just Sam." He turned and walked away, his back as straight as it had been half a century ago on a firing line at Paris Island. The young Marines, including Evans, saw Henderson's salute and scrambled to their feet, standing at attention as the old man walked to his truck. They didn't know the name, but they knew they had just witnessed something sacred. Evans watched him go, the deep roar of the Springfield still echoing in his ears. A lesson in humility, respect, and the timeless art of the rifleman that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The target wasn't the one a mile away. The real target had been his own pride, and an old man with a 1918 rifle had hit it dead center.